I'm going to get into parts. Yesterday when you were talking about how we all have parts that emerge at different times, and they come out, and that there's not actually one kind of overarching part behind that. And so I was wondering, did you mean that when relevance realization finds itself irrelevant and goes silent, and you're kind of in the seat of being, the adverbial, you wouldn't call that like the seat of the self?
No.
So what would you, because, you know, you don't want to get into like secret, sacred self kind of language, you know, but let's say in IFS, behind your parts, you have the self, and the self is love, or like a meta kind of being.
Right.
So I was wondering how you distinguish what's kind of...
Well, I'm very critical of Schwartz's model, both phenomenologically and functionally. The functional problem I have is the descriptions he gives of the self are not particular to any individual, and therefore are not doing one of the central things self as a concept is supposed to do. It doesn't pick anybody out or identify a unique individual in any way. And then he won't say that it's the Jungian self, because Jung doesn't think that the self is like that. And of course, Jung should not have used self for that, because that has just endlessly confused people, because it's actually not yourself.
Right.
So that's the problem I have conceptually. Phenomenologically, what I found when I was doing IFS is I didn't have that sense of a constitutive entity. All I got a sense of was that this I position could make that part more self-reflective in that recursive sense of self that I was distinguishing with Paul between the self of self-organization versus the organization of a self.
Right.
And so for me, I didn't see any good reason to jump to a conclusion about, I found the true self. And when I've talked to other people whose experience in psychotherapy exceeds mine, like Mark Lewis, and he was one of the people that put me onto IFS, but he came to the same conclusion. He said, all that stuff about the self in Schwartz is deeply confused and mistaken and does not correspond to the phenomenological experience of most people when they're in the therapeutic practice.
I also find it confusing, so that's why I really wanted to know what you... And so when you talk to, and this is getting into the weeds with another YouTube video, I hope that's okay, but like with the Aletheia coaching, because he goes levels under where they all kind of come together and work harmoniously, rather than saying that there's one self, of. And so that would be the way that you would see it more.
And I got to talk directly to, I've talked to Steve multiple times, that actually when I brought up that proposal of that stage in which relevance realization finds itself irrelevant, not any particular framing, but framing per se is irrelevant. And I said, is that what you mean, in which there's this final thing in which there's not a transformation, but there's a transformation about transformation? And we talked about it, and we talked about it with Zach Stein, and I mean, we talked about it dialogically, and then he said, yes, that is actually what I'm talking about at that deepest level of Aletheia coaching. So yes, I've got it from Steve that is a correct interpretation.
Yeah, it feels more intuitively. And can I say one last phrase? Okay. And so let's say with your meditation course, when you put on kind of the lens of meta, because you're trying to kind of reciprocally open, right? Yeah. So you kind of clear the ground of being, and then you're ready to reciprocally open. Do I have that correctly? And that in prajna you kind of combine them?
Yeah, I mean, what you're trying to reciprocal opening. Yes, you're trying to do meditatively what we do more affectively when we're falling in love with somebody. You disclose something about yourself, and I reciprocate by disclosing something about myself, and then you get mutually accelerating disclosure. That's literally when you do that with people, they will fall in love. It doesn't have to be erotic love. It can be philia. It can be something else. But that is what you do, and you're trying to do exactly that attentionally rather than just affectively in meta.
Because I feel like Schwartz is trying with the self to get you to just put on a perma-meta, like reach a meta place almost, and call that yourself.
Oh, now I see the connection you're making.
Yes, that's it. That's what I'm kind of getting at. And so it feels to me like you're talking to parts from a meta place so you can reciprocally open.
Yes, that's exactly what I was trying to get at too, that the
are.
self isn't a thing, it is a way in which this process gets, right, a reciprocal opening going.
So I think it's the wrong term, but I think that's what he's trying to do.
But then he should change his term.
Let's tell him.
Yeah,
Because, that's good. We did something.
No. See, I think you're right. That's what he's doing as the therapeutic practice. But I think he has an independent ontological commitment to this notion.
So he does secret, sacred self stuff.
Yes,
and true self. Yeah, and that's no good. Okay, that's what I wanted to know.
All right, thank
you so much.
All right. Person.
I just wanted to say something. I had somebody that helped me do this exploration of IFS, and also somebody many of you might know, and he's sitting right there, one of my most important friends and collaborators, Christopher Masterpietro.
That's you?
Yeah.
Oh, you always talk about him.
I always talk about him because I couldn't talk without him. So.
Well, thank you so much.
All right, thank you. All right, come on up.
Hi. I appreciate you guys being here to talk about consciousness from like a scientific point of view, not a religious kind of point of view. I was wondering, I briefly spoke with Richard about medical assisted dying. It's like kind of a thing in Canada right now. It's in the papers. There's, in the Christian religious tradition, I guess you would say, every soul is worthy, you shouldn't end anyone's life. I mean, from conception to the very end. And now, we've passed laws to say, someone can choose to die. And now in the papers, they're saying like hospital administrators are kind of saying, oh, this costs $30,000 for this guy every day to keep him, alive. So there's kind of like cost benefit put on someone's life. So, you previously, if we're based in Judeo-Christian values, we'd say, whatever the cost, we need to keep these people alive. And now it's kind of shifting to, well, if we could use that $30,000 per day better for someone else, like how does the secular or, regular society put a value kind of on life? Like what's the price that's beneficial to keep someone alive? How do you deem the value of a soul without the Christian framework,
Who do you want to answer first?
Sure, Richard. Yeah.
You can too, if you like.
This is your area of expertise, Richard. Please, you go first.
Well, I don't know what expertise, but yeah, we were chatting before, and there were concerns about MAID at the time it was being proposed. It was really, it was forced upon us by the Supreme Court. And as soon as the legislation was passed, we knew that there would be pressure to loosen the restrictions on it to encompass more types of illness, not just those who are terminally ill and sort of within a short period of dying naturally, but now people are mentally ill as well. So there are a lot of concerns about this, and particularly if you think of the context of Canadian healthcare, which is not in good shape. And MAID might actually appear to be a more attractive alternative to what you're getting in terms of acute care. So that's a concern too. And I think I did mention too as well that I was in Vancouver a couple of years ago, and there was a presentation by a woman who's a member of a transplant team in Vancouver. And what she was proposing was that MAID allow for patients to donate their organs for a transplant. So that the cause of death in that case would be the removal of organs for transplantation.
Right.
So that process would involve the use of extracorporeal membrane oxygenation to keep the internal organs oxygenated while clamping off a carotid artery to kill the brain. So I found that shocking. I'm not easily shocked these days.
Right.
So I came off stunned that someone would actually seriously propose such a thing.
Yeah.
And then I thought about, well, really, why not? I mean, if you're having medically assisted dying, this is a way of helping others. You can gift your organs to others and maybe save some lives. But the concern has to be, I'm not sure about consent at a point where you're about to be rolled into the OR and there are people waiting for your organs and the transplant team is there. So there's that kind of implicit pressure at that point.
The pressures that are, again, if it was with a Christian framework, the pressure is to keep them alive no matter what.
Yeah.
And now it's kind of the opposite.
Yeah, it really is. It's not just Christians who should be concerned about it. There are all kinds of questions that we should be asking. But I'd have to say, the cases that I'm familiar with, they work very well. It's a very humane system. A woman I knew had leukemia. She decided she was going to carry on until she could no longer get out of bed. And so she had the procedure done and saved her a lot of unnecessary suffering. And the team involved in delivering it were very good, very professional, very caring. So I've heard good reports about how it's actually carried out. But your concern is what happens over time as we loosen restrictions.
As our medical care system gets worse and the pressures become more on, is it worth keeping this person alive and then we can use that money to help some other people. And I don't know, it's a tough question when, where does the secular world say, like, we should try to keep this person alive?
And no one should feel guilty that they're soaking up public health dollars either, right? So that's another possibility.
Right, and that was like, it was done to veterans, and it's like, ooh, that's the worst kind of person to do it to. Anyway.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, so my question is for John. I was listening, and I have been listening to you in the past about the topic of higher states of consciousness.
That's not my name for them, but yes.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
what do you call them? Alternate states of consciousness?
No, I call them higher states of consciousness as because they are a species of the genus of altered states of consciousness.
Okay,
but I just want to make it, but that's just the name.
It's helpful.
Right, yeah.
So there's the pure consciousness event, which is lower in terms of, I forget the name that you had for the one that was higher.
Like resonant attunement.
Yes. So I was wondering, because in my meditation, I've had something that I would describe more as mystical experience.
Sure.
And these things, they rebel against terminology. They rebel against verbal communication.
Yeah.
And for me, what I found was an easier method of articulating it was something along the lines of agape revealing itself. And it wasn't anything, so I definitely understood the no-thingness associated with that. But I was wondering where agape in that mystical sense, in terms of a mystical experience, relates to the higher and altered states of consciousness that you talk about in your meaning crisis videos, for example.
Yeah, so good question. So, I mean, there is a distinction between, there's the proposal that there's a continuum between fluency, insight, the flow experience, mystical experience, and then transformative experience. So the higher state of consciousness is a particular kind of mystical experience in that, why it's called higher is in that mystical experience, people feel they've touched something more real than everyday experience. So it's the opposite of the dream. The dream is aberrant. It's not like all of this, and therefore it's less real. And then people do this weird inversion. They have this experience, as you said, it's often ineffable. It's in that sense, it doesn't fit into consensus intelligibility, and they come to exactly the opposite conclusion. That was more real than this, and then they transform their identity and their self. When you take a look at the phenomenology, so you want to distinguish the functionality of what's happening in there. I think there is good reason to believe that the brain is making use of a lot of the machinery by which it tries to generate a sense of realness, and that is not implausible, because the evidence is pretty good, Yaden and others, that when people make these transformations, by many objective measures, they improve their lives, they improve their relationships, they improve their careers, all kinds of stuff. So they're picking up on some real pattern, and that
It's causal.
Yes, well, at least it is affordant. It affords them going, right? So I think that functionality part. The phenomenology, so the unity is there, but there's often an experience of sort of profound beauty, but also interpenetration. Blake's seeing a world in a grain of sand. The whole is in the part is in the whole.
If I might, it was, for me at least, and I've heard relevant commentary from other sources, it was, I think about the three transcendentals that D.C. Schindler was talking about.
Yes.
And in his book on love.
Yeah.
And it felt as though what I had experienced, and again, experience is a word that doesn't quite capture
No,
it.
it's more like, yeah.
It was as if those three transcendentals were something pointing to that.
Yeah, so that's where I was going.
Yeah, okay.
If that's okay. And so that's what I was going to do with, there's a sense of beauty, right? But it's not aesthetic beauty. It's more like appearances are plugged into reality in a deep and profound way. Mm-hmm. There's a sense of realness, so that's the sort of truth. And then there is a fundamental sense of goodness, but not just in the ethical sense. It's the goodness that we find in truth and beauty that is not the same thing as ethical. Like, why do we pursue good? Why do we pursue truth? It's some kind of good. And why do we pursue beauty? Because it's some kind of good. And then we pursue ethical righteousness because it's also a good. And yeah, people report that sort of, it's not quite triangulation, but they see through the transcendentals to a through line between them. And in that sense, I think what we're plausibly seeing is the fact that if you ask people to make normative judgments and you sort of pay attention to what's happening in their brain, and they'll make judgments of the truth of a claim or the beauty of a picture or the goodness of an action, you don't see radically different areas of the brain working. There seems to be, basically it's the same areas being used, being exacted. And I think when you get to that fundamental level of integrated processing, that's what's happening, and it's disclosing something about the world. Now, the conclusion you can't jump to is that is what everybody's always meant by God, because people come out of this experience and they will say radically opposite things about God. Some people will say, I'm so glad I had the experience, now I know there's a God. And other people will come out of that and say, I'm so glad I had that experience because now I know there's no God. So while they report everything you just talked about, and there's sort of plausible stuff about cognition that maps onto it, it doesn't automatically transfer to a metaphysical, theological conclusion.
All right, thank you so much. All right, next.
Hello.
Hi.
So my first question is a brief and practical question. you mentioned earlier that a large part of your project is to create a language that can bridge all of these different sciences of mind.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there any concern that in creating this new language, you will merely add one more competing protocol to the sphere?
Is there concern? Yes. Can this concern be addressed? Yes.
Okay.
And so,
Are there any particular ways, what is it that you...
so what you do is you try to get at what is a good explication of the normativity by which constructs, that's the term, the technical term, are generated. So you have lots of empirical things about construct validity, but you also pay attention to, like we frequently invoke this without realizing. We'll say something's reasonable, it should be taken seriously, it's plausible, and so one of the things I propose with the help of other people is we have a normativity around the generation of new constructs, whether or not they should be taken seriously, considered reasonable, etc. That's not claiming they're true, that's not claiming they're certain, it's claiming that they're plausible, right? And the normativity of plausibility can actually regulate how, in addition to the empirical concerns of good construct, right, can regulate how we come up with these bridging entities. And then what you can do is you can and I did this, right, I've done this in a couple places. I did it in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. You can actually explicate what the normativity of plausibility looks like based on other people's work, and then you use that as a guiding principle. Does that guarantee that you won't make mistakes? No, and no normativity theory does that. Because if it is algorithmic, you can't actually apply it to most problems because you'll hit combinatorial explosion. But as soon as you weaken it into an approximation so that it is computationally tractable, then you got the no free lunch theorem saying that error is inevitable. So the plausibility is a good normative guide for that, addressing that concern, but you shouldn't confuse it with certainty, you shouldn't confuse it with truth, and you shouldn't confuse it with an infallible method.
Okay, so in essence, be sure that you're creating a better language than any of the ones that already exist.
But also be sure that, so plausibility is made up of three components, right? So here's my construct. I want my construct to have been arrived at by many independent lines of argumentation and evidence. I get convergence for what's called trustworthiness. I also want my construct to apply to many different domains, and that's elegance, right? And then I need a balance between how deep the trustworthiness and how deep the elegance is. And so when I have convergence, elegance, and balance, then I have, and you can show this experimentally, those are the components that go into how people make plausible judgments. And so you can have small plausible judgments, like if I make a claim that doesn't require very much forward commitment from you, like I like vanilla ice cream, you don't demand huge trustworthiness. What's all the different lines in your life that have led to that? But if I say to you, maybe the British family is lizard beings, then you should, because that would explain a lot, right? But then you require lots of independent lines of evidence converging on that in order to make sure that that weird construct wasn't the product of bias, right? And so you want plausibility in which there's high trustworthiness balanced with high elegance, and that I put to you as a profound construct. Again, things can be profound, they should be taken very seriously and turn out to be false. Many scientific theories turned out to be exactly that.
All right, thank you. How are we for time?
Just under 2 minutes.
All right. Well, I don't know if you'll be able to address this within 2 minutes. Shifting gears almost entirely, and perhaps you'll be able to get in this in Dr. Maundrell. Is death, the moment, however you describe it, of the irreversible cessation of consciousness, distinct from the process of dying, however it is that you get to that point, is that point an increase in suffering, and is it unnecessary?
Don't quite understand. Good.
So, in terms of avoiding creating unnecessary suffering model, is dying on that model bad? Is actually leaving existence, is that negative for you hedonically as the one who's ceasing existence, leaving consciousness?
It's hard to answer that one. I haven't died, so I'll get back to you on that. Well, there are different ways to die, aren't there? And the dying process is usually going to take a while. All right, so if you stop breathing, you'll probably lose consciousness within 30 seconds, maybe less than 10. So there won't be any suffering after that. You won't be conscious.
Is there any time left?
Really quick response.
I mean, so Epicurus made a distinction of the fear of dying and the fear of death, and he made an argument it doesn't make any sense to fear death, the state of non-existence, because you can't possibly experience it. And so he said it is possible to be fearful of dying and not be fearful of death, and then you need different responses to dying than you do to death. All I should do about death is convince you can't be afraid of it, but you can, and then distinguish it from dying, which you can suffer.
All right. Thank you.
Hi. Opponent processing, virtual engines.
Yes.
It's very core to a lot of the work.
Yes.
In particular, the being and having mode, discernment.
Yes.
What I'm kind of wondering about, and I'm approaching this in a pragmatic way, in a way to try to help, not only like myself and others, is that the perspectival. Is it possible that it can be sort of approached in a similar way? Like, are there perspectival modes? And the way I'm thinking of this is that it's kind of in conjunction with something that a lot of people are pursuing. They're trying to sort of accrue more faith, and I mean that in the da'ath.
Yeah, da'ath. Yeah.
Gratitude,
Yeah.
compassion.
Yeah.
And these are very difficult things to approach directly because it's kind of like sleep.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can't say, go to sleep.
Yeah.
You have to sort of have strategies that increase the probability of that happening.
Yeah, yeah.
So to say, forgive your mother in a direct way, it's not effective.
Yeah, yeah.
The perspective seems to be crucial. And fundamentally, the perspectives are directed outward and inward.
Mm-hmm.
And if we think of Sternberg and the intrapersonal, extrapersonal, interpersonal, I was just kind of wondering, because it seems like with the intrapersonal, the faith is, a lot of the work you do with the relevance realization, religio, what seems to be birthed by that process, the religio is fundamental to da'ath.
Yeah.
In terms of trying to engage that in a kind of conscious way, practical way.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about how, and to take I mean, these words have, we have relationships with them that may not, I'm running out of time, shit.
This has been so interesting following you so far, though.
Okay, so you take prospecting and suspecting.
Yes.
Now, immediately they have their sort of colloquial kind of usages. But if you can think of them in an opponent processing manner, where neither is fundamentally better than the other, but the optimization of them can generate da'ath.
Sure.
And so that's sort of in the intrapersonal and the extrapersonal, where inspection versus inspecting versus expecting. That one's a little more obvious that if it's optimized, gratitude naturally emerges.
Sure.
And in the interpersonal, it seems to be something like respect, which is a term that a lot of people, when they use it, they sort of mean like admire, acknowledge value, sometimes fear.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking it in the most literal way as you would talk about like meta-accommodation,
Yeah.
meta-assimilation, where to respect, to novelly, if that can be an adverb, to look again and look again,
Yeah.
Versus project,
Yes.
where projection is necessary. It's naively insane to enter any interaction without projecting some memory, like you can't do one, or I'm not saying one is better than the other, but the optimization of those two
Yeah.
generates compassion, forgiveness. I'm just wondering about the viability of these ideas and the practical application. Sorry that took so long.
Just over 1 minute, just a little over 1 minute.
So, yeah, I wouldn't want to use the word mode because I think mode is properly, like, for the existential relationship, right? Like you said, the having mode, the being mode. These are existential mode. They're agent arena relationships, etc. But I like what you're doing about that there's a potential, there are potential trade-off relationships between, I think you're doing something like what Stegmeyer is doing with the orientation idea about the way we orient our perspectives. And I'm just reading the book right now, but he's trying to make the argument that I would say orientation is primarily where the perspectival and the participatory are intersecting with each other. And orientation is about doing which way is the perspective being directed, and what impact is it having on the identities you're assuming and the identities you're assigning. So I think, you're asking me for a kind of a snap judgment, but what you're doing sounds at least prima facie plausible to me as a way of thinking about we definitely know the perspectives can clash with each other. That's what the experience of absurdity is. And so, yeah, I think that's something I'd like to talk to you more about, actually.
All right, thank you very much.
That's very interesting.
Hi. First, I'd like to say congratulations for somehow making the format of speed dating even more awkward. I think that is a pretty impressive accomplishment. And I didn't know it was going to be a menage a trois either, so I'm going to try and woo both of you here ultimately. But, so this has been like our third sort of awkward interaction. First, I think I gave you like the death poem of somebody.
I haven't found these interactions awkward, so...
Oh yeah, it's just me, I think.
Okay, yeah.
And I think I also share the Vervaeke neurosis of like not wanting to hold a microphone, but I'll try to make that happen. But
yeah.
In our second interaction, which
is that a new thing, Vervaeke and neurosis? Is that?
I think I just coined that.
Okay.
Hopefully it doesn't catch on.
Yeah.
But in our second completely non-awkward interaction, I remember I asked you if you had published anything specifically on cognitive science of religion.
Yes.
And you had referred me to your Cambridge talk.
Yes.
And I think the awkward part was then I abruptly said, I am going to go watch that now while you talk to these other people. That felt awkward to me. Maybe it wasn't to you. But my point was I did that. So I did go watch the Cambridge talk.
Yeah.
And I noticed...
I said that was the closest thing I had to a cog-sci talk on religion, just to be clear.
Yeah. Well, and so 2 hours later I invested. And I noticed that and this is where maybe hopefully you'll come in, I noticed in the introduction they had mentioned, it was a effusive praise for your work on something called Metaversity. So my question to you is, what is that and what kind of pedagogical potentials do you see in that?
That's James Orr's idea, not mine. I did the Canadian thing. I smiled politely and took his praise, not knowing what the hell he was talking about when he mentioned Metaversity. So I don't.
Yeah, I was wondering about that too. I was like, so is this like Trump University but Vervaeke, or is this
no,
like
that sounds like a horrible idea.
or is this like Vervaeke putting all his stuff on YouTube for vulgar, unwashed masses like myself to consume?
Like, this is really conjectural on my part, but he was talking about that. Yeah, we're getting this. I think. Oh, I'm really hesitant, but I think he was trying. We're moving to like things like YouTube break down the boundary between writing and speaking, because they have the spontaneity of speech but the permanency of writing, and that allows us to connect people in ways we couldn't connect them before, and so the meta university can take place in the metaverse, and that I was.
Oh my God! I hope not in the Facebook metaverse.
Yeah, he wouldn't want that. So as far as I understand what James is talking about, but I think he was trying to say there's a potential to get this new way in which we generate and store knowledge and also disseminate it, that requires a new pedagogy, and that I take it that the meta university is supposed to be the pedagogy that is properly making use of this new potential for education, knowledge generation, and knowledge dissemination, and that I was somehow an exemplar of doing that. That's my best attempt at a rational reconstruction of what James Orr was saying.
It's very impressive.
Pardon me?
It's very impressive effort.
Oh, well, thank you. But don't misunderstand me. I was not doing that at the time. I was just, be Canadian, you're in Cambridge, smile, and accept the compliment, even though you don't know what he's saying.
Fair enough. That kind of undermines my strategy here. But so maybe Richard, what are your feelings on, if not metaversity, the potential for evolution of pedagogical methods, and maybe even the health of the university? And both of you maybe can converse as members of the guild.
Well, that's a big question. We're in the process of discovery right now. We are coming out of the pandemic. A lot of things happened during the pandemic in terms of developing online education and teaching, some of them good, some not so good. And I know that the students that I've spoken to are really divided, some who would prefer to stay online, others who much prefer the classroom experience. How's that going to break down going forward? Because this could be a fundamental change for universities, particularly smaller, remote universities like ours up here. So this is not answering your question, but we're in the process of discovery now. It'll take a couple of years, really, I think, to realize what the consequences of it are.
I don't have anything to add to that. All I can say is I am trying my best to experiment with the help of people like Chris and others with this emergent medium to see what we can do with it that we couldn't do with the more standard pedagogical models, and thereby empower it to act as a bulwark of a lot of negative attractors within YouTube and other social media.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my question is for John about your Awakening from the Me Crisis series.
Yes.
I have two ideas from that I want to see how you think it relates to something else. So one idea is that the way we judge reality is through sort of a coherence and consistency. Is that?
Depends what you mean by that. It can't be understood as a purely logical consistency, because that's algorithmic and that becomes combinatorially explosive. So I propose we had sort of a multi-dimensional way in which we're doing a kind of coherence. And that's why I was talking about the nomological, the narrative, and the normative.
Okay. And the second idea was with Copernicus and Galileo, you talk about the idea of matter becoming a resistance to the will?
Yeah, matter becomes a substantial actuality rather than it was previously, which was a potentiality.
Okay. And what I wanted to see how you thought it related to is I've heard Ian McGilchrist say something that I thought was pretty profound and explanatory, was he said, reality is an imagination that resists the will.
So that, I mean, for some of you are interested in the interaction between Ian and I. Ian and I, about 8 days ago, recorded a deep discussion for Theories of Everything. It should come out soon. And the convergence between his work and mine is significant. Yeah, and so given that, I think Ian wouldn't object too much for me putting more of a cognitive spin on it. Yeah, predictive processing models. The brain is a massively self-organizing, recursive network in which it is trying to predict itself insofar as it's causally interacting with the world. Error is propagating upward and predictions are propagating downward. And you are actually, in a really important sense, imagining most of this room, in that your brain is mostly generating true predictions and only making,
But also phenomenologically, your consciousness is interacting with an imagination of reality, basically, right?
Well, but no, see, that's what I want to challenge. I don't think you're acting with imagination in the same way we hear it when we are looking at an image. What we're actually doing is, if you allow me to bend the metaphor, we're actually looking through it at the world, but the world resists us, and that's the error propagation that comes back.
And that's kind of the point of contact with reality, though, right? That resistance?
I think it's both. I think our sense of realness, and this is a compression of a lot of arguments from the phenomenological tradition, we get our sense of realness both from confirmation when things cohere, and we also get a sense of realness when we are surprised. And I think that reflects the fact that part of how we are doing realization is we are generating a generative model. That's the coherence and the confirmation. But it also is constantly being reorganized by error, by surprise. And your brain is trying to reduce the surprise as best it possibly can so that you better and better can adaptively anticipate the world.
And the surprise is kind of a resistance to your will then, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And you can see, this is right in the heart of science, right? You set everything up. You make things as coherent as you possibly can. You remove all the confounds. You're trying to control for all the alternative explanations. You remove all the vagueness, but you make it such that the world can show you that all of that coherent modeling is actually an error.
Yeah. And one more thing about when you say people having higher states of consciousness, saying that that's more real than reality?
Yes.
Would resistance to will have anything to do with that, do you think?
There's something about the diminishment of the sense of self that is related to that enhanced sense of realness, but I think it has more to do with the sort of the optimal relationship between the confirmation and the surprise, right? You're getting sort of optimal frame breaking and frame making going on in kind of like an ongoing flow state, like a massive insight cascade. And so it's not so much the content, and I've got experimental evidence from my lab, it's not so much the content of the experience, but the processes that the brain is participating in that's giving you that sense of realness.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you.
Hey, thanks for being here. This is pretty awesome.
Thank you for being here. It's pretty awesome for me too.
My pleasure. My question is somewhat where we left off there about the different levels of consciousness. I'm not super familiar with your framework, so.
Sure.
So within the past couple years of following you, Paget, Peterson, I've also been reading a lot of Colin Wilson.
Pajot.
Peugeot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Colin Wilson at all?
I read, what was it, The Outsider, 1,000 years ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Yeah.
So I don't remember very much of it.
A lot of his work, so he was in correspondence with Maslow.
Yeah,
through
I didn't know that.
class.
That's
And
cool.
he did a lot of work on what they were calling peak experiences.
Yeah. Now Maslow I have read a lot of.
Okay, so probably familiar stuff. And when Jordan Peterson talks about Vygotsky and the zone of proximal development,
Yeah.
how that kind of helps put you into the zone, bring you into the zone.
Yeah, and again, Vygotsky is also somebody that I have studied deeply, yes.
And so I've been seeing these patterns, flow state, ZPD, maybe
Yeah,
this is...
in the article we published on the flow state as an insight cascade, we also mapped Csikszentmihalyi stuff onto
Yes.
Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, yes.
Okay, and one of the other patterns that seems to appear to me is like Jacob's ladder.
How so?
Well, the ascension process.
Hmm.
Does the zone of proximal development have anything to do with Platonic ascension?
Yeah, I think it does. And I'm going to develop that argument. I have developed it in some of the episodes that we've already recorded for After Socrates. I think the zone of proximal development is, I'll have to do this fast. The zone of proximal development is sort of the optimal affordance for you internalizing a perspective that you don't currently have. That's how the child acquires metacognition. That's Vygotsky's theory. I think it's a damn good theory, and there's lots of evidence. So because kids can't even introspect until they're about 4 years of age, so they can pick up on other people's mental states way before they can pick up on their own, the exact opposite of the sort of the Cartesian picture. And Vygotsky basically predicts that well, as I think good. So basically, zone of proximal development, let's say I'm the kid and you're my father, I can internalize you, and then that allows me to I imitate you taking a perspective on my perspective until I can get to the place where I can take a perspective on my own perspective, and that makes me metacognitive, and that means that I now can, tweak, I can do the redescription of my own cognition, I can adjust it so I can now see better patterns in the world.
Is that formal cause?
In what way? That's a really provocative
When
thing.
you're watching your father and you're internalizing this, and you see the model of what you should be.
I think in this, if the argument I made about formal cause being able to map it onto, selective and enabling constraints for a dynamical system that I proposed, yes, then the answer is yes. Now, not every Aristotelian would like Uraro and what I'm doing with Uraro, but I would say yes in that way.
Thank you.
That was cool.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, everyone, it is time to break for dinner. We will be back here at 7 o'clock. Since the speakers do have a dinner reservation, I ask that you let them leave. I'll have a chance to speak with them later this evening and tomorrow. So again, thank you all for your time and attention. This was fantastic. The questions were excellent, and thank you both, John and Richard. Take care. See you later.